In April of 2024, a NASA plane flew a radar that can see through the ice about 150 miles off the coast of Greenland. On paper, it was climate work, but 100 feet down, the radar found something that had no business being there. Straight lines, tunnels that crossed each other, a grid buried in the dark, in a place where nature doesn't draw grids. The internet lost its mind, and within days there were headlines about a lost black site, a Cold War ghost dragged into the light by modern radar. Some of that was closer to the truth than people writing it knew, because nobody had lost this place. It had a name, a start date, and a whole file cabinet of paperwork sitting in an army archive the entire time. It was called Camp Century. And the story the army told about it in 1960 and the story that was actually true were never the same story. Not for one single day. 40 feet under the ice is a tunnel lit by bare bulbs, strung along a plywood ceiling. A young specialist is standing close to the core. He sees the needle jump first, and then the Geiger counter starts screening. The army is taking apart its first portable nuclear reactor, and something in the readings has just gone terribly wrong, in a way that nobody down there had calculated for. The commanding officer was a major named Joseph Franklin. He doesn't wait for somebody else to check it. He grabs the radiation meter himself, sweeps the corridor wall, and gets a number off the dial he won't say out loud. It's bad enough that he orders every single man out of there, and only then does he retreat himself. He'd only been in that room for about 2 minutes. When the army finally got Franklin back to the States, they sent him to Bethesda Naval Hospital, where they kept a machine built to measure how much radiation a man was carrying home from a place like that. Franklin lit it up like a Christmas tree. He wasn't standing near the source anymore. He'd become the source. 2 minutes, and the army had a live example of exactly what this exposure would do to a man who followed every order right. This story doesn't start with a shovel in the snow. It starts 2 years earlier in a private room in Copenhagen, in a talk almost no one was allowed to know about. Before I go into that, here is the version that most people today already believe. That Denmark found out decades later that the United States had blindsided them, a small, honest ally that had built its whole name around one rule: no nuclear weapons on Danish soil, ever. Finding out it had been lied to for years by its closest friend. That version isn't wrong exactly. It's just missing one key piece. H.C. Hansen. In November 1957, the American ambassador sits down with the Danish Prime Minister, H.C. Hansen, and asks him a careful question. Would Denmark want to know if the United States put nuclear weapons in Greenland? This question isn't put to him as a request for permission. It's put to him merely as a courtesy, the kind of question that lets a man think he still has a choice, while making it extremely clear what happens if he picks wrong. Denmark's rule was simple: no nuclear weapons on Danish soil, and the quandary for Hansen was he had built his whole name on that line. Greenland was Danish on paper more than in day-to-day control, and after some thought, Hansen writes back a vague note. A note that both sides would later read as permission. He asks the Americans to keep it quiet, never extending this to his own parliament, and even worse, he never tells his own party ministers. So the popular belief is kind of true. For almost everyone in Denmark, the public along with the cabinet had no idea. And when it finally came out, that anger was real. It just wasn't Washington acting alone. The one man whose word who mattered the most, Hansen, had known the whole time, and he made sure his own country never would. That note is really where this whole thing starts. One quiet piece of paper sitting in a file no one in Denmark was allowed to open. To understand why anybody thought burying 600 nuclear missiles under a moving glacier was remotely a good idea, you have to be privy to what the Pentagon actually knew that year, not what history quietly cleaned up afterwards, as it usually does to the detriment of humanity. It's August 21st, 1957, 3 months before Hansen's note. At a test site in Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union launches a rocket called the R-7. It's carrying a dummy hydrogen bomb 6,000 kilometers to a target zone on the far side of their own country. It's the first successful test of the missile built across oceans, ever, by anyone. It was a success, and the Soviets don't sit on it. Within days, they announce out loud to the whole world they now have a doomsday weapon that can hit any major power. The frightening thing is, Washington has nothing that can do that yet. Not one American missile like it exists anywhere on the planet. 6 weeks later, on October 4th, the same rocket family puts Sputnik into orbit. Everyone remembers the beep. Fewer remember what the beep actually meant or proved. The machine that could put a satellite over your head was also the one that could put a hydrogen bomb over your head instead. The flight time, minutes, launched from the other side of the planet. And in 1957, there was no real way to see it coming in time to do a thing about it. You were at the mercy of your God. At the time, the Pentagon had no spy satellites of its own, no way to count Soviet missiles, no way to know for sure. Into that gap walked Nikita Khrushchev, who knew exactly what not knowing was worth. He told the world that his factories turned out missiles, the way American factories turned out hot dogs. Nobody in Washington could prove him wrong, because nobody in Washington could see inside those factories. On November 7th, 1957, a secret report Eisenhower himself ordered landed on his desk. It warned Eisenhower that the Soviets were already ahead of America in every kind of nuclear weapon, and that America wasn't even ready for what might be coming. Within days, this report leaked. Within a month, ordinary families were pouring concrete into their own backyards, stocking canned food and water into their own personal bomb shelters, because their own government's most secret report predicted that this might really happen. American projections at the time put the Soviets at hundreds of these missiles within a few years. America at that point had none. It got a name: the missile gap. The scariest part of this was that it wasn't spin. It was true fear coming from the very top of the country's own defense system. America might already be losing a war that nobody had told them they'd started. When American spy satellites finally got hard numbers years later, the real Soviet missile count wasn't in the hundreds. It was somewhere between 10 and 25. The country every planner in Washington was sure could already bury America in warheads had, at the moment the ground was broken on Camp Century, a grand total of only 4. The backyard shelters, a decade of army officers risking their lives under a glacier, an ally lied to, and a fleet of bombers kept in the air around the clock. All of it built chasing a threat that the real numbers say was Khrushchev's bluff, working just as he engineered it. Then Berlin. November 10th, 1958. During a public speech, Khrushchev calls West Berlin a tumor, and 17 days later, he makes it official. The West has 6 months to pull every soldier out of the city, or hand control of every road and rail line into it over to East Germany, cutting off the West's own troops sitting inside Soviet territory. America had promised by treaty to defend that garrison. 6 months, a hard deadline, all over a city 3 former World War II allies had sworn to hold. That's the room this whole decision got made in. Not a quiet Tuesday with nothing better to argue about, but a country that truly believed it might already be outgunned. Sitting exposed to proven weapons with a flight time you could count on 2 hands. Watching a deadline tick down over Berlin that either side could turn into a real war by mistake. Burying a moving untraceable nuclear force under a glacier nobody could search for wasn't a stunt. It's what people build when they've convinced themselves that the only other choice is losing everything. 18 months later, 2 army officers stand on an ice sheet in Greenland, sporting aviator sunglasses, white in every direction. Colonel John Kirkering and Captain Thomas Evans are picking a spot. It's 150 miles inland for what the paperwork will call a research station. Kirkering will run the whole build. A lieutenant colonel named Elmer Clark had already spent years running the Army's cold weather engineering program. He'd done the groundwork that had even made this spot livable at all. What gets built there over the next year is genuinely impressive, even by today's standards. Trenches cut straight into the surface with a Swiss snow-cutting machine. Ready-made buildings are lowered in. The whole thing is roofed over with curved steel arches the men call wonder arches, then buried by snow courtesy of the wind within weeks. Heated bunks, a hospital, a chapel, drinking water melted right out of the glacier. 200 men living well for as long as the Army desired, inside a hole in the ice. But the men pouring the concrete are on purpose, the only ones read in to what they're actually building. What almost none of them are told is that the men who ordered it are building Camp Century as something else. A 200-man proof of concept, a test run for something much larger. Somewhere above Kirkering's rank before that first camera crew ever got a permission slip, someone in the Pentagon asked only one question that mattered. How do you keep a weapons program secret when you've just spent millions of dollars building it somewhere a spy plane could photograph in the afternoon? The answer that one wasn't more secrecy, it was less. Don't bury the story. Flood it. Hand it to the press yourself. Wrap it in a double helping of dinner, a chapel, a library, a movie theatre, and let it get so warm and so well documented that not even Khrushchev stops to ask what's underneath the part that you've showed them. As I've revealed before, classified programs get looked into. The boring ones, they get ignored. The Army wasn't just building a base, they were selling a narrative. And to sell it, they needed a voice that no one would question. They brought Walter Cronkite up to the ice in 1960. Cronkite was already known as his own man, a fiercely independent journalist who couldn't be bought or persuaded by the government. The military, they knew this. They didn't try and hand him a script. They simply gave him unprecedented access to cover the story, to let his rock-solid credibility do the heavy lifting. Along with Cronkite was a full CBS crew. They packaged a glossy reel about a remote research town. The timing wasn't luck. This was 1960. 3 years after Sputnik had convinced a large chunk of America that the Soviets had not so quietly pulled ahead, a science station, filmed, explained with nothing to hide. The beauty of this ruse was to anybody in Moscow analyzing the footage. It was merely a very loud, very public, non-answer to the one question that mattered. Because a program paraded openly by a journalist who's this trusted couldn't possibly be the program that mattered the most. Camp Century wasn't even the strangest plan on the table that year. Papers made public in the 1990s confirmed what the Pentagon had actually been keeping off the books for over 3 decades. Project Iceworm, a scheme to bury a missile network of nuclear missiles under the Greenland ice sheet. 600 purpose-built Minutemen missiles called Icemen, spread across 2,100 launch silos, linked by rail tunnels running under 135,000 square kilometers of ice. It's an area 3 times the size of Denmark. The missiles were never meant to sit still. They were designed to move non-stop between spots on hidden underground rails. Engineered so no Soviet planner could ever be sure which one of the 2,100 holes had a live weapon in it on any given day. A Soviet first strike might obliterate 100 launch silos, only to find out that they're completely empty, while the real missiles are already miles down the track. waiting to strike back. The strategy solved a real problem, and it wasn't just a strategic one. A fixed silo can be found and destroyed. You can't strike first at a target you can't find. But it was also inside the Pentagon, a fight to survive as a branch, running right alongside the fight to survive as a country. The Air Force had Minutemen fields. The Navy had just put Polaris submarines to sea, hiding warheads under an ocean that nobody could fully search. The Army didn't just build its own weapons that nobody could hit. It risked getting cut down to a plain ground force, while the other two branches split the whole nuclear job between them. To the Army, Iceworm was the answer, a nuclear submarine built out of ice instead of steel. And Camp Century was proof that 200 men could live inside one. There was one flaw, and Clark's own engineers noticed it long before Washington ever had to face the problem. Ice isn't like stone. Under enough weight and warmth, packed snow acts less like a solid and more like a slow, heavy-moving liquid. Every trench they'd cut was less like a tunnel and more like a bubble that the glacier was working every day to close. The holes got narrower every month. The ceilings dropped low enough that the men had to duck where they didn't used to. The steel arches twisted and groaned, and heat made it all worse. Nothing at Camp Century gave off more heat than a nuclear reactor running hot inside a hole, cut in the ice. The room holding the PM-2A bent so badly the engineers had to cut a steel arch open with acetylene torches and rebuild the whole roof every 18 months. The glacier shift was so bad that a team of engineers were removing 20,000 cubic yards of closing-in ice every single year just to keep the camp of 200 men running. Scale that up to 2,100 launch spots across a landmass the size of Denmark, and the math breaks down before even a single missile goes in the ground. The United States military did not lose Project Iceworm to Soviet spies. It lost to Mother Nature's physics. By 1966, the Pentagon quietly shelved the whole thing. The following year, the Army broke the PM-2A down into pieces, hauled it out, and left Camp Century to the weather that had been trying to reclaim it since the very first trench was cut. Now, they didn't leave it clean. Behind them sat around 200,000 litres of diesel fuel, sitting in rusting tanks, all of the base's wiring, the now radioactive coolant, and something close to 24 million litres of raw sewage. But none of that made the promotional real. Years later, when people in Greenland started asking Copenhagen the hard questions about what exactly had been left under the ice, the answers were slow, thin. Alika Hammond, who served as Greenland's Prime Minister, pushed Denmark for a real answer and got, by her own account, only pushback and delay. A government that spends decades not answering a simple question starts to look exactly like a government with a reason not to. The secret held for 11 years. It didn't break because somebody finally talked. It broke because of a fire. January 21st, 1968, a B-52 on a Cold War patrol catches fire in the cabin. The crew are fighting smoke and dying instruments for about 6 hours before they lose the plane 7 miles short of the runway at Thule. What is frightening is this B-52 is carrying 4 hydrogen bombs. At the last minute, 6 crew members eject and live. 1 doesn't survive. The bomb hits the sea ice hard enough to set off the bomb's regular explosives. No nuclear blast, but the explosion does break the bombs open, scattering radioactive material across the ice of the bay. The cleanup runs for months. The Army are racing against the spring thaw before the wreck can sink through the fjord. To this day, by the US government's own records, part of one of the 4 weapons was never found. Somewhere under that ice, or the water below, a piece of hydrogen bomb is still officially missing. The crash did one thing the Pentagon had spent decades trying to stop. It proved in public that the United States had live nuclear weapons over Danish land, breaking the exact rule Denmark prided itself on. It forced a reckoning that Copenhagen couldn't dodge anymore, and that reckoning eventually pulled a thread all the way back to 1957. Denmark's own Prime Minister had quietly waved through. the very thing his country's own rule forbid, 11 years before a burning bomber made it impossible to keep secret much longer. Here's where it's worth splitting what's actually on the record from what the internet has bolted onto it since. Confirmed on real papers and Danish government review, the Hansen memo, the secret 1957 yes, Project Iceworm and its full size, the 1968 crash, the missing weapon part, all of it is checkable, all of it is sourced, all of it is confirmed. What isn't confirmed is the theory, and it's out there, that the missing bomb part was quietly found years later, and the find itself kept secret. There's no paper that confirms that this actually took place, and nobody in my circles can either. There's only an official record saying that the search ended without finding it, that this broken arrow is still indeed down there. And that's a very different thing from proof that somebody found it and said nothing. The honest answer is the least exciting one. Nobody knows. That gap, not a cover-up written down anywhere, is actually what's sitting under the ice. One more thing worth knowing before the credits roll. The PM-2A wasn't the only reactor built by the Army for a posting like this. A close relative, the PM-3A, went into McMurdo Station in Antarctica in 1962. Same program, same mission. Cheap portable power for somewhere too remote for diesel. The crew called it Nuki Poo, for reasons that turned out to be well earned. Over its operating life, it logged more than 400 documented malfunctions. Like the PM-2A, it leaked. By 1972, the ground around it was contaminated enough that the Navy couldn't just remove the reactor. We are told that the United States Navy dug up roughly 12,000 tons of irradiated gravel and shipped it all the way home for burial. But did they? When dealing with the military's classified history, taking the official record at face value is always risky. The government's narrative relies heavily on the Antarctic Treaty signed in 1959 by both the United States and the Soviet Union, which explicitly banned dumping nuclear waste onto that continent. We are supposed to believe that this single line of international law is the entire reason McMurdo's contamination was meticulously packed up and shipped out. But did 12,000 tons of radioactive earth really make that massive journey home? Or was the treaty just a convenient piece of diplomatic theatre to cover up a much simpler, a much cheaper disposal method out of sight? Greenland has no equivalent treaty. Nothing legally forced a cleanup, so nothing happened. And the waste is still down there, still sinking deeper into the ice every year. It was the exact same Army program, with the exact same design flaws. The official paperwork claims one pole got held to account because of a law that existed, while the other didn't. But when the evidence is buried at the bottom of the world, and the only people who have access are transported by the United States Air Force, who really is checking the receipts? Thanks for joining me here today, and remember, they rely on you forgetting, on you clicking away. Don't do it. Go deep down the rabbit hole with this next video, and to make sure the signal can find you again, join the network and click subscribe here, and keep the light alive. This is Think of Arium.